Patient and Family Advocacy for the Brain Recovery Project. Really happy to see you all here. I've seen some of you on my power hours on Facebook, and it's just great to see everyone in person. I'm really glad we're together. I chose to moderate this session because I really wanted to hear what our speaker had to say today. This is Amy McGuire. She works with Dr. Joanna Christodoulou, who has published 2 or 3 papers, I believe, now on our population, doing research at our conferences on reading and cognitive issues after hemispherectomy. Amy's a medical speech language pathologist and a cognitive therapist with inpatient, outpatient, and private practice experience in the at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. Sorry, we all call it Mass General. I'm sure you do too. Dedicated to advancing patient-centered care for patients undergoing neurosurgical intervention, especially those with brain tumors. Founder of the SLP Department's brain tumor team at Mass General Hospital. Prior experience includes clinical practice within ALS and Huntington's disease, clinics at MGH, and in clinical supervision for graduate student SLPs and clinical fellows. Please welcome Amy McGuire. Thank you.
I'm not always the best at using microphones, so for some reason I drop off and you can't hear me. I can't hear you. Alrighty. So I don't know
if you noticed, there's a little QR code if you want my slides. You can scan that and download the slides, or you can type in that little URL in the bottom. I am super thrilled to be here with you. This is actually my first in-person conference since the last few years, so that's exciting. So if you see me around and you want to chat and just say hey and ask questions, whatever, please do, because this is exciting. I have a few disclosures. So I receive compensation in the form of a clinical salary from MGH. I get a research fellowship from the MGH Institute of Health Professions, and I get stock options from a company called React Neuro. And as Audrey mentioned, I am here representing Dr. Joanna Christodoulou, who runs the Brain Education and Mind Lab at the MGH Institute of Health Professions, and we're located in Boston. And since she couldn't be here today with you, you're getting me. A little bit about me, which you already heard. So I actually began working in the arts, and that was where I thought I was going to make my mark in life. I worked in nonprofit management and arts management, and then I decided I wanted to be a speech pathologist. So I moved to Boston. I went to the MGH Institute of Health Professions, and as you heard, now I work at Mass General, and I work very closely with a lot of neurosurgeons. And so my focus is on providing pre-surgical care, assessment, preoperative assessment, and then I'm also frequently in the OR for surgeries that are awake that require some speech and language mapping. And that's a tremendous privilege to be there and have a dialogue with the neurosurgeons. And I love clinical practice, but I wanted to build some research skills. So that's how I ended up back at the IHP with Dr. Christodoulou as a doctoral student. Okay, so by the end of this talk, I'm hoping that you will be able to understand a particular reason why reading and math skills might be difficult after surgery. And this is based on data that we collected from 2019 at the last Brain Recovery Project conference. I want you to maybe acquire a theory of learning that might help us understand academic performance and put it in context, and then maybe apply some concepts related to that theory of learning and the findings from our data collection. Okay, so the roadmap is, we talked to you about the findings and the data from 2019. We're going to put it all in context. We're going to do some tips and takeaways, and then hopefully have plenty of time for questions. Okay, so before we kind of launch in, I really want to acknowledge that I recognize that neurosurgery is a pretty rare and unique experience. I hear that all the time. I see evidence of it with the adults that I work with and with some of the pediatric cases I do see. And that's absolutely, there's no exception there when it comes to a child having neurosurgery. It's scary. And leading up to the decision to have that surgery and afterwards, I know that's kind of a high touch moment with the health system, and you're having lots of visits, and the health system is good at really asking, what happens afterwards. We want to understand some clinical outcomes, but academic outcomes are actually pretty lacking. It's hard to predict for the health providers what is school performance going to be like. And once you have that surgery, and maybe you have some follow-ups, right, but they're getting spaced out more and more, we just don't have good data. And so I don't think I'm saying anything bad. I think we know that there's a bit of a disconnect between that medical health system experience and then the experience that happens in schools. And I don't know if it resonates, but I feel like I've heard something to the degree of, I think the school will know what to do to help my child or me learn. Okay, I got some laughs. Right, uncomfortable, right? Unfortunately, that's just not the case. And so that's part of the goal that I have, that Dr. Christodoulou has, trying to understand a little bit more about what's going to happen in school from this kind of cognitive perspective so we can bridge that divide between the health institutions and academics. Okay, so here we are, 2019. So that's what we wanted to do when we came to the conference in 2019 to gather data. We wanted to expand and get a little bit more information going beyond just the things that are typically collected from, the neuropsychologists in the health system. Dr. Christodoulou had gathered information and data from 2017, and the paper on that data was published during the pandemic. And that effort from being here in 2017 at the conference was really focused on reading skills, trying to understand through a lens of left-sided surgery versus right-sided surgery. What do we know? Is there a difference between the way brain, the intact brain after surgery acquires those reading skills? And the good news is that there isn't necessarily a huge difference, that traditionally the left hemisphere is thought to be the language dominant hemisphere, the place where we do most of our oral language skills acquisition and our reading skills, reading and writing. What happens when you have surgery on the left side of the brain? Does that mean that that intact right hemisphere is going to have a lot of difficulty? There might be a difference in the speed at which you acquire those skills, but the right side of the brain can learn to read as well. And so that should be reassuring. And you heard Monica talk about that a little earlier. We want to bring that data back to schools and say, my child needs reading intervention, we need reading mechanics intervention, and we want it to be consistent and robust. One interesting piece from this study was that, when we think about left versus right reading skills, there was no significant difference between performance in word reading, only in timed conditions. So if we're timing somebody and we're doing like read for speed, there's no difference whether you had surgery on the right or the left. But if we take away that time constraint, there is a little bit of a difference. And so that means that if you've had surgery on the left, it's all the more reason to kind of double down on some of that reading intervention. Okay, so we wanted to also go beyond reading skills, because we started to look at that. Hopefully we'll continue with reading skills, but we wanted to go beyond it with our 2019 data collection. And so we expanded to include other assessments like math. Okay, so this is just a little snapshot of some of the data from 2019. There were 29 participants whose data were included in this. We were fairly balanced in terms of gender, right? It's almost 50-50. In terms of surgical side, you might be able to see here that there's a little bit of a skew. There are more patients or participants who had surgery on the left than the right. So that kind of limits how much we can use the lens to say, is there a difference between having surgery on the left or surgery on the right? So because there's a little bit of that skew, we're just going to look at the whole population, all 29, and see what we can learn from the entire group. And age of surgery was around 4 years old, and then the age of evaluation at the time of collection ranged from school age, 6 years to 18. Okay, so the deal with the data collection was that those of you, and if you participated, we thank you so much for providing your data, because it's really difficult to find individuals who've had hemispherectomy or epilepsy surgery and get that information. So this is such a great opportunity when everybody's in the same place. So those people who participated did several assessments, we scored them, and then we put them into our delightful computers. And we sort of asked ourselves this icon of construction. It's like, what model are we going to build? What do we want to do with this information? And how are we going to kind of put the ingredients, these assessments and scores together so that we are learning something about these academic skills, right? So when we're building a model, I was not a very strong statistics person, and I'm building on those skills, but model never meant anything to me. So when we talk about building a model and we're doing this analysis, we want to understand, what's the goal of these models? So we wanted to look at math, and we wanted to look at reading and see. Math has not been explored in the literature. There's very little information dealing with math skills in a school context. Most of the studies that include some sort of math measure, it's like very meager calculation, right? So it's like counting and maybe sequencing, but that's kind of it. So we wanted to look at math in a more robust way, and we use this KTEA Math Concepts and Applications test, which is pretty cool because there's an easel, and we get to present a visual, like maybe like want to know if you have 5 ducks in the pond and you take away 2, how many are left? So there's a visual, and I ask a question that's verbal, and then it's untimed. Person can take as much time as they need to think about it, and there's also an opportunity to, you know, like take notes or do whatever work you want to do on the side to answer that. So we're really maximizing that math conceptual thinking. Reading included measures of real word reading and then kind of fake word, we say non-word reading. And the reason we include both of those is because it loads different types of reading skills and gives us a little bit more information about how robust the reading system is. And then we included both timed contexts for word reading and untimed contexts, right? And that's partially because of that data from 2017, okay? So these are the 2 models we're making, and I try to make it a little more palatable. So let's like kind of imagine that as we're sort of thinking about these models and why, we're kind of just like baking cakes in a way. All right, so we want to have sort of like a math cake that we want to know something about. We want a reading cake, okay? And so then we want to think about what ingredients we're going to use for these cakes. The ingredients that we decided to use are basically performance cognitive skills that probably go into reading as well as math. And we wanted to kind of put them into our model and put them into our like magical statistics oven and say, what do we know about like the importance of these ingredients to make this math cake or to make this reading cake? Like what's really happening? What's key here, right? So we took some vocabulary, some verbal skills, because in order to answer those math questions and read, you need some vocabulary knowledge for that. We also included nonverbal skills because we wanted to be able to kind of control for that piece, because we're always using some nonverbal skills to do a lot of the tasks that we're asked to do in school. And then we added some executive function measure in there. An executive function, many of you may know like a lot about executive function, but it also can be a little bit mysterious. So the way I operationalize what executive function means in this context is that it's dealing with some categorical thinking. So seeing patterns, thinking about seeing those categories and then switching between them. And that's actually a lot of cognitive work. Self-monitoring how we're doing as we're doing the task. That's a huge part of executive function. And then also sort of updating, right? So every time a new question comes along, can I kind of refresh my brain and answer that question, right? So that was the executive function ingredient. And then there was working memory. And working memory in this context was a digit sequencing task where I give a string of numbers. So if I say 5, 1, 3, you're gonna listen to that, hold on to those numbers, and the task is to put those numbers in order from smallest to biggest. So if I said 5, 1, 3, what you give back hopefully is 1, 3, 5. So we take those things that we say, I think all of these skills in the orange box go into math performance, and I think all these skills go into reading performance. All right, put them in the statistics magic oven, and tell me what's the most important ingredient determining how I'm going to do on math, this math test and this reading test. Okay, this is the crux of why I'm so thankful that you come here and you are contributing to data, because when we do research, what we're really trying to do, yes, this tells us something about the 29 people that provided that information, but what's really exciting is that when we talk about these models, like the case that we're making, the reason why we do it is because we want to be able to make some sort of generalization to other people who are going to have hemispherectomy surgery, epilepsy surgery, now, in the past, later on. We want to be able to say, we took 29 other people, and maybe all we had was one of these measures. What can that tell us about how they're going to do on math reading? Okay, so the thing that we found was that, interestingly enough, this working memory bit was the most significant predictor of both math and reading. It's kind of interesting. When we kind of think about what that actually means in practice, for every point that someone scores higher in that working memory task, right, that ability to kind of take in those numbers and sequence the digits, it's likely that the person is going to score 3 points higher in the math test, right? So there's a really strong relationship there. The stronger you perform in that working memory task, the stronger that math score is likely to be. Similarly, same thing for reading. A little different, like
2.9 instead of 3.0. But for every point higher someone scores in working memory, a student might score about 3 points higher in that word reading test as well. So there's a really strong relationship there. We kind of stepped back and kind of thought, well, what is that? Right? The other, I'll throw in one other interesting thing. So the other ingredient that was also kind of important, maybe not quite as robust, but also significant, was the vocabulary measure. And so recognizing that the words that people recognize and know, the words they've been exposed to and can process meaning and attach meaning to, that also very much helped math performance, this conceptual math performance, right? And we might not always think that because we kind of think math, numbers, but there's so much language involved in reasoning and trying to think about math strategically in a really applied way. So for every point higher in verbal skills that someone scored on the vocabulary, the score in math was likely to be 0.5 points higher, right? So we could take this information and say, a sample of other people out there in the world, if all we have is their working memory score, we can have a kind of a pretty good idea of how they're doing with math and how they might be doing with reading. Interestingly, working memory hasn't been a really big explicit focus when we look at the epilepsy surgery or hemispherectomy literature. And so, again, I'm thinking, why is that? What is it about working memory? How many people kind of had a robust understanding of like working memory before I started talking about this? Yeah, right? And I hear that even among my colleagues. They're like, what is working memory really? So I'm going to try to put it in context for you. What is working memory? I want to be able to know that. And then we want to know, okay, if we understand something about working memory, what do we do with that? How does it help and apply to school? So, hopefully I succeed here. So working memory, I want you to think about it like a temporary storage area. And I got these post-it notes here, because how many times have you been like on the phone taking information, you're like, I gotta write this down, and you write it down, and let's think what happens if you have the really tiny post-it note. That really limits how much information you can put down, right? So you're either going to be really efficient because you kind of know what they're talking about, you can write a clear note, or you're going to be like writing as small as you can to cram as much as possible in that note, right? So everybody's working memory is maybe a little bit different. It kind of varies from person to person. It's really important though for learning, okay? For learning and adaptation as we move through life, as we go from moment to moment. And it also depends on the type of information coming in. So the novelty of the information is very important, right? If you're presenting somebody with a bunch of new information, like they've never heard of before, you know, if anybody's going to the National Ability Center and I love rock climbing, I love the theme of this conference. That's cool. So you're going and you're like, I've never done that before. It's all new. You're going to be inundated with new information that you have to kind of hold in your working memory and rapidly attach to things that you might know. That's what working memory is going to do in that scenario, right? We know from the literature that if everything you're getting in is new information, you're really only going to hold on to that in your working memory for like 20 seconds. It's really brief. It's a super temporary storage space. And if everything is new like that, we can only handle about 4, maybe less, 4 pieces of information. Okay, but that's dynamic. And the way we harness the power of working memory is by having prior knowledge. Okay, so if you're getting a new piece of information and it's really important that you have something to attach it to, something that you can kind of stick it to in the brain. Does it make sense so far? Then that capacity becomes more dynamic. Okay. One of the great things that we know is that working memory can absolutely improve after surgery, brain surgery. There's a study from 2007 that said working memory significantly improved after epilepsy surgery with no difference between the pre or the post-surgery when, you know, whether it was left or right-sided. There was a difference, a significant one. Granted, that study was looking at temporal lobectomy. And so we need more information about how working memory serves people after different types of epilepsy surgery. Recovery may depend on where, and how extensive the surgery was. And if you look at this image, right, this is sort of a picture of all of the different brain regions that might be implicated in working memory. I think we're very used to seeing pictures of the brain where we kind of have blobs of function on the outside, but this internal architecture is also extremely important, and it's a huge part of working memory. When people have disconnection surgery, the goal is to try and disrupt some of those pathways, so really trying to understand what happened in the surgery and how that's related to working memory is an important piece for the future. Okay, so the answer here is working memory. Reading and math skills might be difficult after surgery because working memory was impacted in some way. Maybe we're not quite looking at it in the way we could or can expand that in the future. Okay, so now we want to try and understand a theory to put working memory in more context. And that theory is cognitive load theory. Has anybody heard of this before? A little bit? Cool. All right, so cognitive load theory can help us understand working memory. It's kind of a shorthand. We might be able to think about cognitive load and cognitive load theory like we're talking about working memory, but we're trying to give it more granularity. We're trying to make it operational, right? And that's applicable to school and daily life, right? We're not always learning brand new things. School is in fact built on this idea that classes and grade levels build on the knowledge that you've been acquiring. Same thing with daily life. That's why we build our experiences, we build routines, and oftentimes we choose things that have some amount of familiarity and enjoyment to them because we're kind of learning through that process. And that's really, really important, right? So again, connecting new information to things we already know makes learning more efficient. And that's a fundamental cornerstone of cognitive load theory. Okay, so the key parts of cognitive load theory are these. There's the task or the problem itself, which we want to understand. Then there's, and that's called intrinsic load. So it's sort of like built in, it's baked into the situation. Then there's the format of instruction. So the directions that come with it, and this other piece that it is the environment around us. That's the extraneous cognitive load. And these are, again, different ways of thinking about how working memory is going to be engaged. And then there's the prior knowledge that you might have and how you're applying all that knowledge to solving this problem or doing the task. And maybe you're drawing on some strategies and skills you've already learned. That's the germane cognitive load. So let's take an example, right? Let's say there's laundry that you got to do. I'm always using laundry as an example. I guess I do a lot. So the task itself, right? You've got laundry, it's got to get done. If you've never done laundry before, right? It's different than if you've done it before. But there's a load of laundry. What's your timeline? Does it have to get done immediately? Is the laundry filled with different types of fabrics that need special treatments? This is going to dictate the intrinsic nature of that laundry problem. Okay. Extraneous load, right? What's the format for doing this laundry today? Do you already know how to use the washer dryer? Is the washer dryer broken and you're going to have to go out to the laundromat and find one and then contend with who else is at the laundromat? Is it a dryer or a washer? Is there a special kind of preparation, detergent, things like that? Those are extraneous to the situation. And then, again, like I mentioned, have you done laundry before? Right? That's the germane load. Maybe you're so motivated that you've done laundry a lot and you're like, how can I make this even more efficient? I'm going to prepare ahead of time. I sort my wets and darks, and that's part of the germane load, the way you're applying it and the strategies that you're using to get it done. And sometimes those, that knowledge scaffolding and the strategies that you're able to apply are things that we can explicitly expect the school system to kind of double down and teach, and also kind of teach in day-to-day life. Okay, so in general, are you with me? If we have this task or problem structure, this intrinsic load we're thinking about, we used to think that this didn't change. It was like a fixed state. Now we're recognizing we can recalibrate it. And the intrinsic load might change because of the learner, okay? So this is where the fact that neurosurgery is a unique experience for children and adults, this is where this comes in because it's very individual-centric. It's learner-specific. So you want to calibrate that intrinsic load when you're thinking about what problem is my child trying to solve right now. We want to calibrate it for them, right? We want to think about reducing the extraneous load. This is really, really key. And there are a lot of different levels that we can think about how to do that. And then when we're thinking about that germane load, what we know and the strategies that we're applying, we actually want to increase that load, okay? So that's sort of like a good load. It's sort of like the mental weight that we're lifting. This is like healthy weight. We like that. And the reason I like cognitive load theory so much is that built into the theory is this kind of like innate acknowledgement that effective instruction is going to hinge on cognitive architecture. It's very tied to recognizing that architecture, in this case, brain structure and function. And it's different for people who have had neurosurgery, right? So it's very applicable there. Knowing the learner's cognitive architecture, right? So what happened after surgery and what's going on up there is required in order to create effective instruction for ongoing learning. And this is something that I think school systems can benefit a lot from. Okay, so here's this theory, and now we're going to try to do a little bit more application. Okay, I heard that one question that often comes up is like, what's the ideal curriculum? What should the school be doing? And I don't have that answer for you, right? School systems are so different, and your child, or you, if you've had surgery and you're here in the audience, right? Your needs are unique, right? And so there's not necessarily one curriculum that I can say, this is how this all can get solved. And it makes sense that you might also ask, given our findings from the 2019 data, well, if working memory is so important for math and reading, how do I make it better? Okay. It's a totally legitimate question. In the literature, they've actually done some randomized clinical trials, which are like top of the evidence period. We love that. However, the findings are a little bit mixed, right? And so working memory training programs, the ones that have been studied in this context, they've been computerized programs that are designed to treat working memory and expand that capacity, right? So instead of 3 numbers, number of 935, 135, example, we're expanding that to a larger number of numbers to put in sequence. The gains are limited in time, right? So they might not last very long, and they're kind of narrow, right? So they're narrow in the practice context that are part of that training program. And when we're thinking about why that might be, I can come up with some reasons. But in short, I actually think it's because cognitive load theory is a better way to think about how to engage working memory and maximize what any learner has available to them, right? So it's not necessarily going to yield strong performance in a more general context just to make that working memory capacity bigger. So even if we taught you to the test, and you were like, now I can do 3, 5, 1, 7, 8, 2, 9. Even if you can do that, actually there's other literature to suggest that even if you have a really large working memory, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to do better in math. So it's associated with it. The key is that we want to tie your working memory, your expanded working memory performance, to information that is rich in meaning. So we want to make it very relevant to the subject, okay? And that has to come with you along the way as you're learning throughout the years of your education. You're building upon the knowledge that you already have continually, and the working memory is doing that in tandem. So task analysis is actually another way to really think about, like, how do we get more concrete about what we can ask the school system to provide, how we can think about building working memory and optimizing cognitive load in day-to-day life. And task analysis, we can kind of think about it as input, integration, and output. It gives us a little bit more information to work with when we're trying to figure out all these different types of cognitive load. Okay. So if we're thinking about input, we can do this with any task. This is why it can be really useful and powerful, right? If my child is trying to do something, what is the input? What is sitting right in front of them? How is it coming in? What's the sensory modality, the input? Is it visual, right? Is it auditory, right? And is it auditory over like a long period of time, or is it just like a little short thing that they listen to? Is it involving tactile information? And does that sensory touch information mean that they have to perform motor things as well? I don't know, right? So really thinking about what's coming in. And then we want to think about the meaningfulness of that information. Is it concrete? Is it something that they've learned before? Is it something that they already kind of think about in day-to-day life? Or is it pretty abstract and they kind of have to do it and experience it in order to get something out of it, right? So something happening at the National Ability Center tomorrow would be kind of abstract until they actually get into the room and they get to experience it, and put it in their body and actually doing it. They're like, oh, wow, I just learned this new task. Right? And then is it verbal or non-verbal? So that's input, like what's presenting right in the initial moment. Then there's this integration, and integration is kind of happening all the time, but if we really have a specific task to accomplish, we want to think about how much integration is required in order to do well on that task, right? Attention is really important, okay? And attention is very adjacent to working memory. It's a little different, but attention, you're using attention right now. Hopefully I'm sort of entertaining enough, right? So do you have to focus on one thing, right? Or do you have to focus on many things, right? You gotta hold more things in your mind. And then how long do you have to hold that stuff in your mind? How long do you have to focus on it, right? That really matters, because the longer I ask you to attend, and it's maybe not interesting, or hopefully it does, right? The harder that task can become. And again, if you're thinking about multiple things, in order to try and solve the problem, if you have to switch and do a lot of mental switching between those things, I think I mentioned earlier, cognitive switching is very costly, okay? And you can just get really tired just trying to think internally. You're sitting there thinking, it can be tiring, right? Distractions are another huge piece of integration, and that's kind of related to that extraneous load piece, right? So thinking about the external environment when somebody is trying to solve a problem, whether that's in school or just in the backyard, right? Is there a lot of motion happening around them? That's going to be a distraction. We don't really think about it, but I guarantee you that for all of us as adults, that's a true phenomenon. Is there a lot of noise, right? Is the temperature kind of a distraction? Is the other parameters in the environment, right? That external piece can actually help reduce the level of integration that's required. There's also the internal state of the learner themselves. Are they experiencing a lot of emotions that day? Are they upset about something? Are they really joyful about something? Physical sensations. Do they have a stomach ache? Do they have a headache? Are they feeling are they looking and behaving in a foggy way that we're like, I know you're not having a great day, right? What's your internal state for answering that question? This is important. As well as thought loops. And then thinking about that integration across, I would say cognitive domain, but what I'm trying to operationalize is, if there's symbolic thinking, are we thinking in categories, are we trying to sequence a lot of things? Is there a lot of reasoning, or are we just kind of being asked to take it in and regurgitate back, right? And all of those different things have their place. Okay? And then there's the time, right? Again, remember this untimed and timed context, right? For children who have had neurosurgery, it's probably a lot more likely we might get rid of timed context as much as possible. And then maybe, in certain moments we say, let's just try it for time and see what happens. But sometimes it's just too much pressure. Then finally, we want to think about the output. What is it that they're going to need to do to show their performance, right? Is it kind of simple, like you can recognize it, I'm going to look at something and then tell you something about it. So there's information presented in the question itself, right? Is it more recall-based? There's not much to recognize. You got to dredge it up from your memory banks and be like, oh, I think I heard that 2 weeks ago. I don't know if that's what they're talking about. That's a lot more work, right? And they have to rely on information that they've seen or learned at a prior time. Are they going to be asked to create or interpret things, right? And if that is part of the performance task, we might need to support that in a lot of different ways. And then always thinking about that output in terms of modality, right? If it's visual, it's going to be like a written word, it might be art, it might be something more abstract, that's fine. But if somebody has a visual deficit or a legal change, right, that might be actually a lot more demanding, it might need to be modified, right? Is the output auditory? Are they going to just need to speak the response? And does that work for that particular learner? Or is the output really motor, and that includes pointing or touching, so they have to manipulate anything, and we want to kind of reduce that demand if that's not going to work for the learner. Okay. So I'm trying to convey that I think task analysis and cognitive load theory are really powerful operational tools when you're thinking about how do we help optimize the situation for a learner post-neurosurgery, right? They give us insights about the task itself and different frameworks so that we can think about the task and whether it's scaled in the way we want it to be. And we can kind of think about insights into what it's telling about the learner themselves, right? Task analysis can build that germane load, which is what we want. We wanted to increase the germane load, that idea of prior knowledge and giving some skills that are metacognitive, right? Metacognitive awareness around the strategies that you're using to solve it, really calling them out and naming them, because that ultimately is going to be empowering. Okay, so these are kind of summary slides, but when we talk about performance modality and how it matters, we're really talking about decreasing that extraneous load, which is exactly what we want to do. So we touched upon these already a little bit, particularly if there's a motor demand in a task, and especially if somebody has needed to learn how to use that non-dominant hand, right? We really want to remove our extend time limits in test settings, right? We also want to think about, are there alternatives to handwriting that we could actually put into place as an accommodation? If the performance is very kind of like written language output heavy, can that be dictated, speech to text? Could there be kind of a scribe? And sometimes it's useful to even have a scribe to help somebody brainstorm, right? If it's an essay, right? That can be very helpful just to kind of talk and all kinds of it, right? Sometimes certain types of typing can also work for people as well. If it's visual, we really want to think about reformatting materials when it's possible to kind of accommodate if there's a visual field cut or kind of a visual perceptual attention preference. So we might want to change the text size, you're probably all aware of that. We might want to change the text spacing and increase the font size, or the positioning on the page. So if there is a visual field cut or a slight preference towards the left or right side of the page, you may want to orient the text when possible to that preferred side of the page. And then using a straight edge, like a piece of paper or something to block out text elsewhere on the page can actually reduce some of the distraction demand. So again, that's decreasing extraneous load. Thinking about compensatory aids and technology where possible, again, another method to decrease the extraneous load. So I particularly think that when there's something that you're just memorizing, there were so many things that I had memorized in school, right? Sometimes that seems to be a huge emphasis. If that is a big part of a student's experience, that might not be the best thing to focus someone's learning on, right? So if there's technology that can easily compensate for math fluency, arithmetic, things like that, advocating for use of a calculator whenever possible is really important to let somebody focus a little bit more on that conceptual math applied performance. Text-to-speech can be a really great opportunity. There are some apps called Speechify, and now most pieces of technology have some degree of technology that offers that. Using or reviewing voice recordings as a note-taking or a learning skill can be helpful. And then particularly if there are tests or performance-based assessments in school where you're going to need like key charts or tables or particular blocks of information that have just been covered in curriculum, advocating to have use of those available consistently can be very helpful as well. This is a little bit more in process. We want to be able to build metacognitive skills for learning information in order to increase that germane load, remember? So we want to be able to, as parents, as friends, as family members, the more we can explicitly highlight subject matter kind of commonalities, the better. This is thinking in parallel, right? So we want to find different themes across subjects and contexts and really point that out because that's actually building vocabulary and it's also creating more semantic associations in the brain, semantic meaning meaningful association. And that all contributes to essentially brain network connectivity, right? And the more we can do that, the more connections we have, the more kind of secondary pathways we might be able to use. If you remember that picture of like all those different colored network connections, we want to be able to use as much of that architecture as possible, right? So you can expand language by finding different ways to deliver a similar message across something. If you want to increase opportunities for explicit code switching through language, we can kind of emphasize, how would you say that if you were talking to your teacher? How would you say that if you were talking to your pet? How would you say that if you were talking to your best friend versus somebody that you think of? And really trying to highlight that and give opportunities to kind of practice that. Actively promoting categorical thinking in a very explicit way is also very helpful, right? So saying, like I put that in the category of, things that I like to do on vacation. I put that in the category of like how to be safe when I'm not close to home, right? And these are kind of getting a little bit abstract, but the more you can draw attention to that and create routine around it, the better. Another example is like, that was just like that other time when, and you probably do all of this already to some degree, but even kind of doing it a bit more and trying to be strategic about how you encourage other people in the family to do that as well can be really useful. And then sharing your insights explicitly rather than implicitly. I can't emphasize this enough. Sometimes in speech pathology, Therapy, that's a lot of what we're doing, and then we're trying to put strategies to it, right? So just really being unafraid to kind of talk about, especially social pragmatic things, right? I thought this because I noticed these things that this person did. I didn't know that before, but when this happened, I learned that, right? And just really using that as verbal routine. And some general reading and math takeaways here. With respect to reading, okay, reading performance is always going to be experience and exposure dependent, right? And so we want to find ways to engage with reading, not just in school, but outside of school as well. And so we want to think very creatively and flexibly about how this can happen in different contexts, right? So again, exposure to different words, that's the vocabulary piece, and ways of speaking, that's that code switching piece that I was mentioning before. How do you say this to somebody in this context versus another context? Making that purposeful really helps. More time on the task of reading is also really important for building the domain load, right? So even if it's just, a little bit of, we're going to try to sound out these words, but then I'm going to read the rest of the book with you, or read this paragraph, and then we'll use an audiobook, and you can kind of enjoy getting more of the information from the book in a more immediate sense. That's a nice hybrid approach, and I don't know if we endorse that enough. So text-to-speech audiobooks, they really do support conceptual acquisition beyond word-level reading, right? And that also helps decrease extraneous load further down the line when reading to learn, when we move beyond just the decoding, that decreases the extraneous load. We want to foster experiential co-reading opportunities. So, again, kind of going in tandem and saying, you try this, and then I'll take over for a time, right, to try and avoid fatigue. Giving opportunities for choice around reading topics is also really important in terms of that kind of domain load. You want to harness interests that people already have. And then conceptual and applied math performance really requires that explicit discussion piece, right? So even when we talk about conceptual and applied math, we're really talking about problem solving. And so considering purposeful kind of debrief opportunities, whether it's about things that happen in a day and challenges or problems that somebody encountered, they could be very mundane or they could be more prominent. That's a great way to try and build this dialogue around problem solving to become a bit more routine. That's all I have for you. Questions?